All right, so we're into our fourth segment, and we'll be brief with this one. Now let's quickly talk about, obviously, Bush, George W. and his father were on video. I think we talked about this earlier, Stan, that they want to distance themselves from having the Bush and the Obama antagonism because they overlap each other with the last election. So it was classy to have them on video. I personally thought McCain was god-awful in terms of his presence, and we talked about this last night. What about the absence of the most dominant, loved, excitable conservative? No, we're not talking about Newt Gingrich. Sarah Palin, the other rock star. Would she have taken away? She had some strength moving in early with the book and being on a national talking tour. Would she have been someone that the Democrats could have seized upon? Do you think that's why she was kept away?
I think she would have been more of a distraction at the convention. I think she's a very polarizing figure, so people either love her or hate her.
But draws so many people that.
But the thing is, at this convention, we have so many strong Republican women that we could focus on.
Right, like Condoleezza Rice.
Why focus on one person, Sarah Palin, when you had this plethora of strong Republican females that gave wonderful speeches, and I think we had such a good visibility of the diversity of the Republican Party to let people know that we are a party of diversity. And so why focus on one female when we had this great line of females?
And Stan, let me ask you this very briefly so we can end this segment. Is Sarah Palin through politically? Can she go anywhere from here? Can she run for elected? Could she be on a national ticket 4 years from now?
She could run easily for senator from Alaska.
No, but I mean,
senator is a very important position. But look, you have to look at Palin's position with regard to the convention. She is a big enough person, a real American patriot. She understands that there would have been issues perhaps raised by the Democrats had she been there that cannot be raised when she was not. And she is a big enough human being to realize and to subsume whatever personal ambition she might have for the greater good of the party and the country. I don't think she really wanted to go there for that reason, although she would have accepted if she'd been asked.
All right, we're in our last segment, and I thought we'd have a little bit of fun in looking at, obviously next week the Democrats will be showcased. What I did was I went back and looked at the accepted speeches for Democrats and Republican conventions from 1960 onward, my lifetime basically, being born in 1962. And the three that I thought were the most outstanding, obviously Ronald Reagan was number one. I couldn't really differentiate between 1980 and 1984, except in 1980 when he said, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" I think that's probably the most quoted line you'll ever have. The second best I really enjoyed was John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier. The idea of, here we were at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and well, that was before that, but I mean, it was the idea of here we are in the Cold War era, and the idea that he was putting it right out there. I thought he was great at number two, and then my third best was Bill Clinton's first term. I know, Democrat. But the very first time we talked about Hobart and so on, that was cheesy, but it gave you a sense of him as a person. I thought my three worst acceptance speeches that I looked at, number one had to clearly be Jimmy Carter. You were in Minneapolis for the last convention. You had him describing Hubert Humphrey, a 1968 presidential candidate, one of the stalwarts of federal government, U.S. Senator.
Happy warrior.
Yeah, call him Horatio Hornblower, whatever it was, just 2 weeks after he died, in a national audience. Stan, I think you would agree that that has to go as one of the worst conventions for him. And then I think the second worst I had was Al Gore, with the stuff, the phoniness, with kissing his wife and trying to act like he was a hip guy, and it was just so awkward. And then the third one I had, and ironically, of all the YouTube videos that I looked at, the one presidential candidate that you could not get embedding for to lift it as a separate video, believe it or not, was Gerald Ford. And you think with all the, I realize today it's different than it was in 1976, but Gerald Ford's 76 convention was just god-awful. And even when he won the nomination, and a brokered convention, you had Ronald Reagan he calls his opponent back to the podium to be further embarrassed by the enormous strength for Reagan. What about that, Stan?
Well, I think you have to consider that within the context
what do you
of the
think of the
times.
rankings, though, the good and the bad?
Oh, I wouldn't quarrel with that at all. But with specific respect to Ford and Reagan, I think you have to consider it within the context of the times. I mean, the Republican Party was shattered at that point. Nixon had just been forced out of office, the first president ever to resign, under fire in order to avoid impeachment and probable indictment,
Right.
which would have been well deserved. And here was Gerald Ford, who was an accidental president.
The bumbling, stumbling.
Yeah, who was actually was a fairly clever fellow, but because he fell down that airline ramp that time, he became a bumbler and a stumbler.
Remember when he was,
Walk and
remember
chew
they
gum
had
at the same time. All
remember the
jokes
thing they
about
had with him making the toast, and the toast was burnt, and he had ended up going back to the chef?
And then you had him next to Ronald Reagan, who turned out to be the greatest Republican president of the 20th century. And you say to yourself, first of all, how could Ford have done anything other than look bad, but particularly in that time when the Republican Party was crying out for somebody to restore them, and Ford was clearly not the man.
Right.
I don't see how it could have been anything other than what it was.
And Dana, you know, coming out of Watergate, the gas crisis, the 73 Arab-Israeli war, inflation was bad. You probably, well, you were a kid like I was back then, but the gas lines, Stan was obviously a grown-up driving his car.
Well, I'm
probably
20 years
in
older than you are,
that's
man.
right. But
Which enables me to bring a certain degree of maturity to these discussions.
that's
I have to
right,
keep
that's
that in
right.
mind.
But seriously though, in looking at 1976, you had Jimmy Carter, as bad as he was, who wins, and you had Gerald Ford, and so to me, that has to go down as probably the worst choice we ever had in our lifetime for president. How does that compare with Romney versus Obama?
Well, it was kind of like a...
And before you even say anything, I'm going to give you the last word, because we know Stan thinks Obama's a communist. And but you're pretty strong on this Romney-Ryan ticket, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah, but how do I think it compares? Well, first of all, I
To
think
Ford and Carter.
Yeah, but first of all, I think Ford is badly underestimated, and I think if you study the things that he did, and the positions that he took, and the decisions he made, you'll find that he was quite a bit better as a president than the media currently gives him
You talking
credit
about Carter or you
for.
talking
I'm
about
talking about Ford.
Right.
Then if you go on to Carter until the election of Barack Obama, well, he was certainly the worst president that we had in the second half of the 20th century. The difference between the difference between Carter and Obama is that Carter was bumbling and often incompetent and unable really to relate well with people.
And
Obama relates very well
Right.
to people, but he's not so bumbling as he is malevolent. It's the difference between incompetence and malevolence. I think Obama intends for the United States to become weaker, less influential, poorer, and more subject internally to an intrusive and controlling government. Carter never intended that, whatever else he may have wanted.
Well, and thank you. That was very well done, and I didn't interrupt you this time. David, thank you. You've got the last word. You know somewhat. I'm sure you've done a lot of your homework on looking at Carter, Ford, and as the other presidential elections coming up to this point. How does Carter, Ford compare to Romney, Obama? And in the case of Ford, if he hadn't pardoned Nixon, he probably would have won. Considering the fact that he even overcame Ronald Reagan in that convention. What does that say about this election? Can Romney win? Is this as bad of a choice as that one was?
Well, I'm looking at this as history repeats itself. You had Gerald Ford, that unfortunately his candidacy was just not
And he
strong.
certainly couldn't define himself as a person.
And it was not strong. So then we end up getting a president that is just plain bad, which sets us up for America to be ready for a great president in Ronald Reagan. If you look at this now, 4 years ago, became a good guy.
Good guy.
But not the strongest candidacy.
Mhm.
So we end up getting Obama, which I believe is a bad president.
What about what Romney said too? He says, the best thing about Obama that you could feel was when you voted for him.
Exactly.
I think that, more than anything.
He's doing like you were saying about Ronald Reagan, about saying about, are you better off 4 years
Right.
now than 4 years ago? And Romney is alluding to that. We're not better off. And so I think history starts to repeat itself, and now people are going to really appreciate, after 4 years under the Obama administration, going with Romney, realizing that we are not better off than we were 4 years ago. Gas prices, what, were $1.84 a gallon 4 years ago? How much are they now? Almost $4?
Yeah.
We are not better off.
Well, the other thing too is I think people will be interested in seeing how, I think clearly the electoral votes favor Obama, but I think the vote is going to be so close, and there'll be some key states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, that could go either way. If you had to say right now, how confident you are Romney winning in November?
I think Romney will. I think Romney will win a very, very close election. I think right now the momentum is with him. He has pulled ahead of Obama slightly. Obama, of course, will get a bounce out of his convention too. And say 3 weeks or a month after the Democratic convention, things will begin to become clear. There are a small fraction of undecideds. They'll make up their minds, and that'll determine the outcome.
Well, and I'll give you the last word, Dana, and we thank you very much for your presence here today, right after the convention. Obviously, the Democrats are going to gain some momentum with Obama next week, and they'll have intense media coverage, and then it's up to the two to sell themselves after next week's convention in Charlotte, their Democratic convention. How confident are you that Romney can pull it out? Having been at the convention yourself and seeing the potency of the speakers that were there, the representation.
I'm very confident, and I believe that we will win in November. And I think with the Democratic convention, I saw like some of their setups, that they're not doing the great columns this year, and the smoke and mirrors, because I think everyone realizes that was just completely fake and false. And people are starting to realize is that they were sold a bill of goods that was not what they were buying into.
Well, for Sally Gillis, who had to leave early today, and for Stan Escudero, and for Dana Doherty Swanson, the state committee woman and delegate to the Republican National Convention in Tampa. This is Henry Frederick of Headline Surfer. You can check us out on headlinesurfer.com, nsbnews.net. This was the Roundtable.